Royal mistresses and favorites. They are usually mentioned when talking about France during the period of absolute monarchy, although it can be confidently stated that such a phenomenon existed at all times. Not nobles, but an upstart close to the monarch or a charming commoner who enchanted the ruler. These are timeless stories as old as the world itself. It's just that in Western Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries, favoritism acquired new features and turned into a major political institution. The relationships between rulers and their favorites are generally a favorite topic for literature and cinema. However, it is often portrayed somewhat one-sidedly, focusing mainly on the romantic aspect of the issue. Although many favorites did not sleep with their rulers at all, their main task was to shoulder the burden of state affairs. To carry the burden of state affairs while the leader was having fun at balls and tournaments. Yes, and among the royal mistresses there were some truly extraordinary women who not only warmed the king's bed but also had a huge influence on political processes. In this episode, I'll tell you how royal mistresses and favorites lived and what they did besides bedroom pleasures. How much influence they had over their crowned lovers. You'll also learn what the fundamental difference is between a favorite and a royal mistress in the European understanding of these terms. What such a position at court could offer and what dangers it could bring. And of course, part of my story will be dedicated to the most famous favorites and mistresses of the rulers of the Russian Empire. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How They Lived section open. Let's begin. Queens and royal mistresses. First, I need to say a few general words about the character of my story, or rather about two characters at once. A ruler's favorite is always his mistress, and not a secret one, but someone well known to those around him. The lucky chosen ones who were close to the royal person received a lot of benefits. From lavish gifts and titles to the opportunity to place their own people in lucrative positions and directly interfere in state affairs. In Europe, a ruler having a mistress was considered normal, or even having several mistresses was considered absolutely normal. Besides the usual male tendency toward polygamy, one can see here the legacy of pre-Christian times, when a king could have several wives at once, even if his subjects were only allowed one. It should also be noted that royal marriages were usually dynastic. In other words, they were arranged by relatives purely for political reasons. Few cared about the opinions of those actually getting married. It was not uncommon for princesses who were still playing with dolls to be married off to equally young heirs to the throne. Obviously, under such circumstances, it was hard to expect love and sexual harmony in the royal family. Of course, there were exceptions, but they only proved the rule, and no one expected deep feelings from the king and queen anyway. Their main task was to produce an heir. The other aspects of royal family life didn't really matter. But while kings didn't bother much with marital fidelity, queens were held to a completely different standard. There couldn't be even a shadow of doubt about the legitimacy of the children. Usually they even gave birth in front of a large crowd. Such was the fear that the royal child might be switched. Queens had no political power, at least not while the king was alive. A queen could only become truly significant in one case: if her husband died unexpectedly and her son was still underage. Then she would become a regent and rule the country on behalf of the heir. But the life of royal mistresses was not as easy as it might seem at first glance. Getting into the monarch's bed was relatively simple. It was much harder to stay there. The main enemy of any royal mistress, of course, was age. After all, there were always plenty of young predators circling around the monarch. Every trick was used. The best cosmetics, ice baths, physical exercises, routines, special skincare. Diana de Poitiers, the young Henry II's mistress, whom I will talk about a bit later, drank a solution of gold chloride with diethyl ether. She ruined her health with this hellish cocktail. Surprisingly, not all royal mistresses were beauties. For example, the English King James II chose Arabella Churchill as his mistress, whom contemporaries called ugly, although they did note her sharp mind. Even the famous Anne Boleyn, who captivated Henry VIII, could hardly be called a beauty. Royal mistresses were not only unmarried girls but also married ladies. Few could or even wanted to refuse the monarch. Usually there were no problems with the husbands. They would receive a good position, a title, or a generous monetary reward. But there were also unfortunate exceptions. For example, there is a well-known story. Francis they heard about the beauty of Lady Françoise, the wife of the ruler of Brittany. It was a small medieval state, and he desperately wanted to possess her. However, the beauty's husband was very jealous, so he locked his wife in a castle and ordered a ring to be made, which he attached to every letter where he summoned her to court. The king ordered a servant to steal the ring, made a copy, and finally managed to lure Françoise to him. Francis loved the beauty for 10 years and then returned her to her husband. To punish his wife, he locked her in a dark room and then even ordered her to be killed. It often happened that the king had several mistresses at the same time. Then real women's wars would break out at court, fierce and merciless. The most underhanded methods were used to discredit a rival. For example, Eleanor Gwyn, the favorite of English King Charles II, had a rival who put a laxative in her food. The unfortunate girl was disgraced at the most crucial moment during intercourse with the monarch. After such a special night, she was no longer one of the king's favorites. Technocrat favorites. A favorite didn't necessarily have to sleep with the king or even the queen, although that did happen sometimes. For example, the Duke of Buckingham was a lover of James I, and Menshikov was probably in a homosexual relationship with Peter I. Maybe I'm wrong, but who knows? Catherine II had dozens of favorites and lovers. However, the sexual aspects in this case were only of secondary importance. A favorite was considered a person especially close to the king, a trusted advisor and assistant. In Western Europe, favoritism developed during the era of centralized states, when the workload of the ruler increased many times over. But after all, not every monarch could spend days poring over documents, delving into state affairs. And that's when favorites came to their aid, professionals, skilled administrators, personally loyal to the ruler. Правителю. Typical examples of royal favorites were the famous Cardinal Richelieu in France, Conte Olivars in Spain, and Georg von Hertz in Sweden. Favorites carried out the necessary state reforms, strengthened the army, dealt with international politics, and curbed feudal independence. All of them had enormous influence and authority, often obtained by bypassing existing rules and traditions. That is why the nobility did not like the favorites. They were considered upstarts without noble lineage who had wormed their way into the king's trust. Often, that was indeed the case. For example, the closest advisor to King Louis XV of France was his barber, Olivier Le Dain. He turned out to be such a skillful schemer that his contemporaries nicknamed him Olivier the Devil and Olivier the Scoundrel. Favorites were also beneficial to the monarch in the sense that they played the role of the villain while the ruler appeared to be kind. It was usually in their name that the most unpopular decisions were made. If anything happened, the king could always say, "It was all him, the villain." I didn't know anything about this at all, so it's no wonder that ordinary people rarely liked royal favorites. Despite their enormous power, male favorites often ended their days on the scaffold. Because, as you've already understood, the nobility hated them, and commoners considered them the main culprits of their troubles. As a rule, problems for royal favorites began after the death of their patrons, when no one could protect them from the general wrath anymore. It should be said that often such punishments were quite deserved. Not all favorites were statesmen like, for example, Richelieu. There were plenty of ordinary grabbers among them who used their access to the monarch for personal enrichment. Buckingham went from a poor nobleman to the actual ruler of the country in just a few years. And all because he was considered the most perfectly built man in all of England. Buckingham not only shamelessly took bribes and stole from the treasury, but also proved to be a terrible administrator. He lost several wars, ruined the state finances, and turned parliament against himself. France under the heel. The system of royal mistresses has existed throughout history, but it reached its peak in France during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. In the middle of the 15th century, the institution of ladies-in-waiting appeared at the French court, which was immediately highly appreciated by the men at court. Previously, they used a special brothel that was maintained at the state's expense. Ladies-in-waiting more often than others became the lovers of kings. After that, everything depended on the girl herself, on her intelligence and feminine charm. Not everyone managed to achieve the position of Marquise de Pompadour, who for 2 decades practically ruled the state. It was at the French court that the title of official royal mistress appeared. The first to receive it was Agnès Sorel, the lover of Charles VII. She was considered one of the most beautiful women of her time and managed to completely captivate the king. As a gift from Charles, Sorel received castles and vast estates. She also advanced all her relatives' fortunes, securing titles and positions at court for them. The status of official royal mistress did not give Agnès Sorel any new material benefits. It only indicated her high position at court. To emphasize it even more, she wore the longest train after the queen. Sorel also got involved in politics. For example, she strongly supported continuing the war with the English until they were completely driven out of French land. Agnès Sorel gave birth to 3 children for Charles and died at the age of 29. Some contemporaries spoke of poisoning. In the mid-2000s, the body of the first royal mistress was exhumed and a huge amount of mercury was found in the tissues. So the rumors about poison could very well have had some basis. Well, the being a royal mistress has always been quite dangerous. The final establishment of the institution of official royal mistresses took place under Francis III. This amorous monarch literally collected beauties. He had many mistresses, but only a few of them were honored to become official royal mistresses. Under Francis, being appointed to this honorable position became an open and solemn event, held in the presence of the entire court. This was the king's way of letting his new lover know that she was not just another fleeting infatuation, but a true lady of his heart. Overall, during the reign of Francis III, the cult of the royal mistress at the French court began to strongly resemble the chivalric traditions of adoration for a beautiful lady. Henri II's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, was 20 years older than the monarch. They met when the future king was only 7 years old. She was called the true ruler of France. She not only placed her people in key positions, but also conducted diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers and even with the Pope himself. On her advice, the king made the most important decisions, declared wars, and concluded peace. However, Diana de Poitiers instantly lost her power when Henry II died accidentally at a jousting tournament. Here, the queen took revenge on her husband's mistress for years of humiliation. She took away all of Poitiers' castles and even the jewels given to her by the king. And she sent the former favorite into exile. Well, at least she didn't have her executed. Another well-known womanizer on the French throne was Henry IV. His exploits became legendary. He had dozens of mistresses, but the king had only 2 official mistresses. The monarch's first chosen one was Gabrielle d'Estrées, who already had an impressive background even before meeting Henry. She was a real beauty, and her greedy relatives took full advantage of that. Since she was 16, Gabrielle was placed in the beds of wealthy and noble womanizers. She was, in a way, a valuable family asset. It would have continued like that if the girl hadn't caught the king's eye. Gabrielle became his lover, and then his official mistress. She bore Henry IV 4 children who were granted legitimate status. The king became so enamored with the girl that he even wanted to marry her, but this was prevented by the sudden death of d'Estrées. However, Henry did not grieve for long. He found comfort in the arms of another beauty, Henriette d'Entragues. Her cunning relatives sold her virginity to the king for 100,000 écus, the title of marquise, and a written promise to marry her. The king paid the money, but he did not marry Henrietta. The furious family of the would-be queen organized a real conspiracy, which, however, was uncovered. In the 18th century in France, historians often call it the century of women because of the strong influence of royal favorites on politics, science, and art. Frederick II even called the reign of King Louis XV the rule of 3 petticoats. However, exactly whom he meant is still a matter of debate. The most famous favorite of Louis XV was undoubtedly the Marquise de Pompadour, who ruled France unchallenged for 2 decades. She placed her people in all key government positions, controlled finances, and foreign policy. Pompadour is considered the chief advocate for the 7 Years' War, since it was beneficial to the financiers who were close to the royal favorite. Even after losing some of her attractiveness with age, Pompadour maintained her influence over the king. Moreover, she even started choosing young mistresses for Louis herself. The last in the line of French royal favorites was Jeanne du Barry. She outlived her royal lover Louis XV and was executed after the French Revolution. In the 19th century, court favoritism in the style of Madame Pompadour and the Duke of Buckingham came to an end. After the Great French Revolution, monarchs no longer dared to openly display their lovers to the public, as they well understood how it could end. Under the shadow of the double-headed eagle. Russian autocrats were also no strangers to small human weaknesses. Therefore, Russian favoritism has a rather rich history. It began long before the Romanovs. Everyone knows the favorites of Ivan the Terrible, Malyuta Skuratov, and Fyodor Basmanov. Vasily Golitsyn, the favorite of Princess Sofia Alexeyevna, enjoyed enormous influence. However, the true heyday of favoritism in Russia came during the gallant 18th century. You could say that everything here followed global trends. However, there was also a distinct national flavor. If in 18th century Europe it was the era of brilliant female favorites like the Marquise de Pompadour, then in the Russian Empire it was male favorites who set the tone. Simply because at that time, the Russian throne was mostly occupied by women. Peter, I had dozens of male and female favorites. The most famous of them was Menshikov, who rose meteorically from an orderly to a prince and the actual ruler of the country. They had rather strange relations with the emperor. In St. Petersburg, people said that the Tsar and Menshikov lived in a debauched manner. At the beginning of the century, the country plunged for a decade into the era of Bironovshchina, a grim period of rule by Anna Ioannovna's favorite, Biron. Then the cheerful Empress Elizabeth Petrovna ascended the throne, who was more interested in outfits and dances, while the country was ruled by her numerous lovers, the Shuvalovs, Vorontsov, and the Razumovskis. However, unlike the uncouth Biron, they were educated and progressive people, carried out reforms, and supported culture and the sciences. Shuvalov himself, for example, founded Moscow University. The heyday of favoritism in the Russian Empire came during the reign of Catherine II, who, during yet another coup, overthrew her husband and took the throne. She was a passionate woman in general and had dozens of lovers, but this did not harm the country. Catherine allowed only those favorites who had the ability for it to participate in state affairs. The rest served only for the empress's intimate pleasures. In the 19th century, favoritism in Russia declined. Of course, the emperors had mistresses, but they did not take part in politics. The only exception was the last Russian emperor, Nicholas II. His favorite, Grigory Rasputin, proved faithful for both the empire and the Romanov dynasty itself. Instead of an epilogue, favoritism is an extremely vivid historical phenomenon that arouses constant interest not only among professional historians, but also among the general public. And that's not surprising. The atmosphere of intrigue, sensuality, luxury, and glamour leaves few people indifferent. We are used to thinking that history is always driven by large-scale forces, like economic trends or class struggle. Meanwhile, ordinary human strategies sometimes have no less influence on the course of history. But that's all for now. Goodbye, everyone.